Her drunk stepfather traded her at 14 for a broken rifle to a fur trapper. The rifle was on my work table when Harlan Foss came through the door. I remember that because I was looking at it, not at him, when he announced what he'd brought me. The stock had a long split running from the wrist down toward the butt plate, bad enough that someone had wrapped rawhide around it wet, let it dry, and called it fixed. It wasn't fixed. The rawhide had shrunk wrong and pulled the wood further apart. The grain was compromised all along the split, and what I was turning over in my mind was whether there was any saving that wood at all or whether the whole stock needed to be pulled, and a new one fitted. I had a piece of black walnut in the back that might have done, but cutting a new stock takes the better part of a week if you want it right, and the man who'd left this rifle with me had wanted it back in 3 days. So I was studying that split with my lamp pulled close, trying to find a way through a problem that might not have one, when Harlan Foss said the words that changed my life. He said, "I got a girl outside." I set down the piece of rawhide I'd been picking at. I turned around. Harlan was a big man gone soft, the kind that had probably been genuinely formidable at 30 and had spent the next 20 years living off the memory of it. He had a red face and thick hands, the knuckles roughened but not from labor anymore, from weather and drink. He smelled of something cheap and sweet, the trade whiskey they cut with tobacco juice down at Colbert's, I'd been told, though I'd never bought any myself. His coat had a grease stain on the lapel roughly the shape of a hand. His hat had been quality once. He was smiling at me the way men smile when they've already decided the conversation is going to go their way and they're just waiting for the other party to realize it too. "I traded for her," he said, "off a trapper name of Wells, cost me a rifle." He nodded toward my work table. "That one." I looked at the broken rifle. I looked back at Harlan Foss. "She's 14, he said. "Her mama's dead. I was married to the mama, so technically." He shrugged. The shrug explained everything and nothing. The kind of shrug a man gives when he knows exactly what he's doing and doesn't intend to examine it closely, because examining it closely would require him to be a different kind of man than he was. "She needs somebody to take her in. I can't keep her. I got my own situation." "Your situation?" I said. "I'm moving on, going south, New Mexico way." He spread his hands open. "Look, nothing up my sleeve. She can't come where I'm going." I didn't ask what was south. I already knew he wouldn't tell me anything worth knowing, and I also knew, with the particular certainty of a man who has fixed other men's broken things for long enough, that whatever was south for Harlan Foss was the kind of thing a man runs toward because he's running away from something else. "You brought her here," I said. "You're the gunsmith," he said, as if that explained it entirely. As if fixing things made a man responsible for everything that was broken in the world. "She's a 14-year-old girl," I said, "not a mechanism." "No," he said. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable for about a second. "But you've got the room, I heard, and you're a decent man, Briggs. I've heard that too. Straight, people trust you." I held his eyes. There was nothing behind them except the calculation, and maybe, somewhere further back, a thing he didn't want to look at directly. Whatever conscience he'd been born with, he'd worn down to something that couldn't give him much trouble anymore. "How long ago did her mother die?" I said. "February." It was April. He'd been carrying her around for 2 months, or Wells had, or both of them, passing her between them the way men pass a problem they don't want to hold for long. I didn't say anything else. I walked to the front of the shop and went out through the door. She was standing at the edge of my porch, not quite on it, with her weight on her back foot, as if she hadn't decided whether she was allowed to be there. She had a canvas sack over one shoulder, just the one which told me everything about what she owned. Her hair was dark and needed attention, not from neglect exactly, more from the quality of attention available to a girl traveling in rough country with rough men for 2 months. She was wearing a dress that had been made for someone taller. The hem came to her boot tops and had been taken up with uneven stitches, the thread bright white against the faded blue cotton, recent work, not hers. She was looking down the street in the direction Harlan Foss was already walking, not running. He was too practiced for that, just walking away at a steady pace that said he'd made his calculation and filed it and was done. She didn't look at me right away. The street was doing what streets in small towns do in the middle of the day. A wagon going by with loose boards that rattled, somebody's mule tied at the post outside Colbert's, switching at flies, 2 women coming out of the dry goods store with their arms full. Ordinary things. The kind of things that keep happening while something extraordinary is occurring. When she looked at me, I saw that she'd been crying, or that she was right at the edge of it, and that she was fighting it with everything she had. Her jaw was set. I had known men who were in serious pain, the kind that comes from a wound that should have been seen to and wasn't, and they held themselves the same way. Like if they stopped holding, they'd come apart. Her eyes were very dark, almost black in the afternoon light, and there was something in them that I thought of later as a kind of ledger work. She was looking at me and adding up columns, trying to determine what the total was and whether she could live with it. "He left," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." She nodded once slowly, the way people nod when they already knew a thing and were just confirming it. "I'm not his," she said. "He wasn't my father. My mother married him 2 years ago after my real father died. My name is Nora Birch." She said this precisely with a care that I recognized as the care of someone stating facts they're afraid might be contested. "My mother's name was Clara Birch. She died this past February. Fever." "I'm sorry," I said. "The trapper's name was Wells," she said. "Foss traded me to him in November, said he couldn't feed me through the winter. Wells kept me through the winter at his camp. He was—" She stopped. She started again, more carefully, like she was choosing each word and being sure it was the right one. "He wasn't the worst man I could have been with, but he wasn't good either. When spring came, he had a run to make up into the territory, and Foss had told him there was a man in Patience who'd take me in. I don't know why he said that. I don't know why he said your name. He said my name specifically. He told Wells, find Calhoun Briggs in Patience, the gunsmith, he'll take the girl." Her eyes were steady on mine. "Did you know Harlan Foss?" "Before today." "He left a rifle with me once," I said. "Maybe 2 years ago, paid me for the work and left. I didn't know his name until today." She absorbed this. She didn't look particularly surprised. She had the look of someone for whom things failing to make sense had become the normal condition of existence, and who had learned to proceed anyway. "I can work," she said. The words came out with a particular kind of force, like she'd been rehearsing them in her head for a while and wanted them to land right. "I can cook and clean. I know how to sew. I can learn whatever else you need learned. I'm not asking for charity. I'll earn what I take, and I won't take more than I earn. I'm not a burden." She said the last part like it was something she needed me to believe, like she'd been called a burden and was fighting against it. I looked at her standing there on the edge of my porch with her second-hand dress and her canvas sack and her jaw set against everything that was pressing down on her, and I thought several things more or less at the same time. I thought, she's 14 years old. I thought, she has nowhere to go. I thought, I have a spare room that I'm currently using for storage. I thought, the storage can go somewhere else. "Come inside," I said. Something went out of her shoulders when I said it. Just a fraction. She'd been holding against a possibility, and the possibility had not come, and her body registered the absence of it before she did. She came up onto the porch and through the door, and I followed her in. The spare room had been collecting things for 3 years. Boxes of parts, old stock blanks I hadn't used, a broken chair I kept meaning to fix, the kind of general accumulation that happens when there's no one to tell you the accumulation is happening. It took me most of an evening to move it all to the back room of the shop, and I made 2 trips to the dry goods store to come back with a proper lamp and a new wick, because the lamp that had been in the spare room had a bent collar and threw a bad flame. While I was doing all of this, Nora Birch found the kitchen. I came back from the last trip to the shop to find the stove going and something that smelled of onions and salt pork in the pot. She had found the larder and made use of what was in it, and the table was cleared. It had been holding a surveying map I'd been using to settle a land dispute I was helping Alcott with, and 3 weeks' worth of the Laramie paper, and the 2 plates I owned were set across from each other with the 2 forks. I stood in the kitchen doorway taking this in. She'd fed Porter, too. I saw that when I looked for him and found him next to the stove, sitting with the patient expression of a dog who has decided a person is acceptable, which Porter did not do easily. He had not sat next to the stove for any reason other than warmth in the 3 years I'd had him. I don't know why that particular thing moved through me the way it did. A dog sitting next to a stove because a girl had fed him. It shouldn't have amounted to much, but I stood there for a moment and felt something shift in the house, some quality of the air, and then I went and washed my hands and we sat down to eat. She told me about herself in careful pieces over that meal. Her father had been a cattleman near Cheyenne, not a large operation but a legitimate one, 200 head and a decent piece of grass. He'd been the kind of man who did things properly, which she said the way someone says something they miss very specifically. He taught her to ride before she could walk well, she said, and taught her to read from 3, and when she was 9 he'd put the cattle accounts in her hands and told her to learn them. She had the voice of a girl who had been given responsibility early and had not found it too heavy, which meant it probably hadn't been given to her as a burden but as a trust. He died when she was 12. A horse fell crossing a creek, the bank gave way and the horse rolled and he was underneath. She said this matter-of-factly, the way people state things they've had time to set in the past, where they keep it so they can function without it constantly arriving fresh. Her mother had done what she could after that. They'd had to let most of the hands go. They'd sold a portion of the herd. By the time Foss came along offering stability, the alternative was not much. I didn't ask about the winter with Wells. She'd tell me what she wanted to tell me in her own time, and if she didn't want to tell me, that was her business. What mattered right now was that she was here and there was food in front of her, and a room behind the door at the end of the hall with a lamp that threw a decent flame. After supper, I showed her the room. I'd put my old bedroll on the floor to serve as a mattress until I could arrange something better, and she stood in the doorway looking at it and then looked at me. I told her, "This is yours. The door has a latch. I'm at the front of the house." I said goodnight and went to bed. In the morning, she had coffee made before I was up. She'd found where I kept it and the pot, and had figured out that my stove ran hot on the right side and needed to have the damper managed. She handed me the coffee when I came in, the cup already poured, and said, "I think your back burner runs cold. Is that the one you usually use for the pot?" I said yes. She said, "Move it to the right side and close the damper down about a third. It'll hold better." She was right about that, too. I want to be careful here and honest about what I mean when I tell the next few years. Because a man can tell a story like this wrong without meaning to, and you'd come away thinking something that isn't what it was. Nora Birch was 14 years old when she came to my shop. I was 41. I'm telling you those numbers plainly because they're real and they matter, and I'm not going to soft-pedal them. What I felt for her from the first day, what I can tell you now from a distance of years, was responsibility. The kind a man feels for someone who's been put in his care, not by his choice but by circumstance, which is perhaps the most serious kind because there's no contract and no exit clause and it's just between you and your own character. The same thing you feel for a hurt animal that's showed up on your porch. The same thing you feel for a neighbor's child who's been left alone too long. You do what needs doing, and you don't examine your motives too closely because the examination is beside the point. The point is what's in front of you. I tell you this because what happened later happened much later, when she was not a child. And because it only means what it means because of the years in between, and those years need to be understood on their own terms. She enrolled herself in school that fall. I hadn't suggested it. She simply appeared one morning with her hair brushed and asked me if I had a primer or any books. I gave her what I had on the shelf, a Bible, a copy of Blackstone's that I'd used to settle disputes for people, a worn-out almanac, and a surveying handbook. And within the week, she'd introduced herself to Alcott at the schoolhouse and asked if she could attend. Alcott told me later, when I ran into him at the dry goods store, that she was the sharpest student he'd encountered in 3 years in patience. He said this with the slight bewilderment of a man who'd expected less. She also, within 2 weeks of arriving, took over the shop's books. I had kept a ledger after a fashion, by which I mean I had a collection of pencil notes on whatever paper was near the vise when I remembered to write something down, numbers on the back of envelopes, names on bits of brown paper from the dry goods packing, dates on the margins of the Laramie paper. Nora found this system one afternoon when she was helping me look for a note I'd made about a barrel delivery. She sorted through the pile on the counter with an expression of careful neutrality, not judgment, just the face of a person taking in a situation and beginning to form a plan. She said, "Can I organize this?" I said she could try. She had it squared away in 2 days. Every transaction I'd made in the past 3 months sorted and tallied, the outstanding debts listed and dated, the income summarized by week. She showed it to me and I sat with it for a while and then I handed it back and said, "Keep it." She kept it from that day on and I never had to think about it again, which freed up a portion of my mind I hadn't known was occupied. That first winter I made up the spare room properly. A real bedstead from a freighter who'd come through selling household goods, a proper mattress from the dry goods store, a coverlet that the minister's wife had put together for the church sale. Nora bought curtain cloth with the first wages I paid her, a green cotton, a particular shade I can still see exactly when I think about that room, and sewed it into curtains over an evening. She hung them herself. I came back from the shop the next morning, and there they were in the window, a color I hadn't had in the house before, and it looked like someone had made a choice about the place rather than just landing in it. She didn't talk about Wells or Foss. Once, deep into that January when a storm had us both housebound for 3 days and the conversation went to places it wouldn't have otherwise, she asked me if I thought Foss was actually in New Mexico. I said I didn't know. She said, "Good," in a tone that meant she hoped he was very far away from everywhere she would ever be. She never mentioned his name again that winter. The trouble with Dutch Marin started in April, when Nora had been with me about 6 months. Marin ran a freight operation out of a yard on the south end of town, 3 wagons, 6 mules, 2 hired men who did what they were told because Marin paid on time and asked no questions about what they'd been before. He was not the richest man in patience, but he was the loudest, and in a small town that can amount to very nearly the same influence. He had opinions about trade routes and territorial policy, and the price of feed corn and the failures of the marshal's office, and he stated them in the kind of voice that was meant to close conversation rather than open it. He was not without intelligence, which made him more difficult than a purely stupid man would have been. He began coming to the shop that spring, shortly after Nora started working behind the counter. He never came for gun work. His rifle and his revolver were both in good working order, and I never touched either of them. He would come in, lean against the counter, and talk. About freighting, about the weather, about whoever was failing him this week. I worked while he talked, which seemed to be the arrangement he preferred. He was the kind of man who liked an audience that couldn't leave. I didn't enjoy it, but a gunsmith in a small town cannot be too selective about who he lets stand in his shop, particularly in the slow season before trail work picks up. The 3rd or 4th time he came in, Nora was behind the counter with the ledger. He looked at her. It was the kind of look I had learned over years to read in men, not a leer, not anything obvious enough to name in the moment, but a look of assessment, the way a man looks at something he's trying to value. Like he was working out what she was worth and in what terms. He was doing it without thinking, the way certain men always do it, and Nora did not look up from the ledger. He started asking about her, not to her, to me, as if she were furniture. Where had she come from? What was her situation? Was I her guardian legally, or was it more informal? I told him I'd taken her in, she worked in the shop, she was going to school. He nodded in that particular slow way of his that communicated he had heard my answer, and was reserving judgment on whether it was the final one. After he left that day, Nora looked up from the columns she'd been running. "I don't like him," she said. "Neither do I." She went back to the ledger. After a moment she said, without looking up, "He's going to be a problem." She said this in the same tone she might have used to say the south fence needs mending. Observational. Neither worried nor alarmed, just noting conditions as they existed. She was 15 by then. I had come to understand that she had a way of seeing the shape of things before they resolved into obvious forms, and that this was not intuition exactly, more a kind of precision. She looked at the actual facts available to her, all of them, without editing them through what she wanted to be true. She was right about Marin, too. His interest took a particular shape over the following months. He had a nephew, his sister's boy, left with him when the sister died 2 winters back. The nephew's name was Corbin, and he was maybe 19 or 20, a spare, quiet young man with a decent face who worked in the freight yard and did what his uncle told him and didn't say much in company. I had no quarrel with Corbin. He wasn't the issue. The issue was what Marin had decided to do with him. He began floating the idea in the way that certain men in small towns float arrangements, publicly, conversationally, in a way that creates a kind of ambient pressure without ever quite being a direct proposal. He'd say it at the saloon over cards. He'd say it at the feed store while he was loading out. "My nephew's looking to settle, needs a sensible girl who can keep a house. That Birch girl at the gunsmith's must be close to marrying age. Briggs can't intend to keep her there forever." He never finished that last sentence. He didn't have to. He'd look at whoever he was talking to in a way that completed the thought for him, in a way that was worse than if he'd said it. He never said any of it to me directly. That was part of the method. He was too experienced to come straight at me, because coming straight at me would let me come straight back. He preferred to build a pressure from the town, a kind of ambient conclusion that I was supposed to pick up and go along with because fighting the ambient was harder than fighting a man. I heard about it from Alcott. Alcott had heard from his wife, who had heard from 3 different people in the same 2 weeks. Alcott told me with an expression that held equal parts sympathy and curiosity about how I was going to respond. He was not a coward, Alcott. He would have stood up if I'd needed him, but he was a schoolteacher in a small town, and he was careful about choosing his moments. I said I'd think on it. What I thought walking home that evening, it was late spring, the light lasting long up over the ridge to the west, the dust on the street kicked up by a day's traffic beginning to settle. What I thought was that I needed to be clear in my own mind before I was clear with anyone else. The question was not what I owed Dutch Marin. The question was simpler and harder than that. The question was what I owed Nora Birch. She had been given away by a man who was supposed to protect her. She had been kept through a winter by a man she had not chosen, who had made her useful to him in whatever ways he'd decided upon. She'd come out the far side of all of that with her back straight and her jaw set, and a gift for numbers, and a way of reading situations that was more accurate than most grown men I'd known. And she was 15 years old and going to school every day and keeping the shop's books and had put curtains in a room that had had none. The last thing she needed was another man deciding what should happen to her. What she needed was somebody to stand there. Marin came in the following Saturday morning. I knew he was coming. Alcott had told me he'd been talking at the saloon again the night before, and I had spent some time getting clear on what I was going to say. He did his usual thing, leaned on the counter, ran through some freight talk, worked his way around to the subject in about 10 minutes. He said he'd been thinking about Nora's situation. He said a young woman in uncertain circumstances needed to be settled before too long. He said he had a proposal that he thought could work out for everyone involved. I set down the revolver I was working on. I turned around. She's not being settled, I said. She's 15 years old, she's in school. In a year or 2 she'll still be in school, and after that she'll decide whatever she decides, and she'll decide it herself. He held his smile. Now, no need to be short about it, Briggs, I'm only saying. I know what you're saying, I said. You've been saying it all over town for 6 weeks. I'm telling you what the answer is. The smile went thin. Corbin's a good young man, he said. He could provide for her well, better than, he stopped himself, but just barely. Better than what? I said. He let a moment go by. Better than a girl with no family backing and no prospects ought to expect, he said, which was what he'd been thinking the whole time and had just decided to say. She has prospects, I said. She keeps the books for this shop, and she's better at it than anyone in this town. She's going to go on to school when she's old enough, and she's going to make her own way. Whatever decisions she makes about her personal life when she's grown, she'll make them because she wants to, not because someone arranged it. He held my eyes, I held his. You're putting yourself in an odd position, he said, taking in a girl and then keeping her from every natural opportunity. My position is fine, I said. Yours could use some thought. He pushed off the counter. He stood up straight. He was not a small man, and he was used to the effect of his size on people. I was not a small man either, and I was used to working with my hands. You'll find this town has opinions, he said. I expect it does, I said. Towns generally do, I'll let it have them. He left. Nora was in the back room. She came through the connecting door about 30 seconds after I heard his boots off the porch boards, when she was sure he was gone and not coming back. She stood in the doorway holding a pencil and the ledger, and she looked at me. I heard, she said. I figured. Thank you, not elaborate, not performed. Just said the way she said things that she meant. When you're ready to handle your own life, you will, I said. Until then, nobody trades you for anything. Something went through her face, a brief, involuntary thing that she closed down quickly, but I saw it. She went back to the ledger. I went back to the revolver. That was, I think, the afternoon the shop stopped feeling like a place I'd landed and started feeling like somewhere I'd chosen. Marin didn't come back after that. He did what he'd promised. The town had opinions for a while. I got some looks. People have a complicated relationship with a man who does an unconventional thing, even when the unconventional thing is clearly the right one. They want to think well of it, but they also don't want to feel like they missed something, or that there's a thing going on they don't know about. Alcott's wife talked. She was a forthright woman who had known exactly what Marin was doing and had not liked it, and she said so plainly to anyone who raised the question. Galloway, the minister, a blunt Scotsman who had been sent to frontier postings by a church that kept hoping his bluntness would get more refined with time and kept being wrong, said from the pulpit one Sunday in June that a man who gives an unprotected girl honest work and honest care has done a Christian deed and deserves Christian regard from a Christian community, and that those who cast aspersions on such arrangements might reflect on where their own Christian regard had been when the girl needed it. He said it without naming anyone. The congregation knew. After that, the quality of the looks changed. Nora observed all of it with those dark, calculating eyes and said very little to me about any of it. She mentioned once in passing that people seemed to have settled on something. I said it appeared so. She nodded like this was data she was filing away. She was 15 and she was learning how towns worked, which is a complicated education and one that most people get wrong the first few times. She did say one evening, we were eating supper, late spring, the window open and a cool air coming through, she said, people make up their minds about a situation before they know what it is. I agreed that was generally true. And then they revise when the facts make them, she said. I said that happened too, though less reliably. She considered. It matters a lot, she said, whether the first impression has consequences before the revision comes. I sat with that for a while and realized she was talking about herself, about the months where the looks had a question in them that was adjacent to an accusation, and what that could have meant if it had landed differently. If Galloway had been slower, if Alcott's wife had been a different sort of woman. It worked out, I said. This time, she said, and went back to her food. In the winter of her 17th year, a man came through Patience looking for me by name. His name was Tad Wells. He was the trapper's son. The trapper himself, the man named Wells who had kept Nora through that first winter, had died the previous year, a drowning on a spring crossing near the Wind River, and this was his grown son come to settle what he called a business matter. He was maybe 25, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent their lives in the back country, and he had a look about him, not threatening, more the careful look of a man who has learned to read situations before stepping into them. He came in with a folded piece of paper and laid it on the counter. It was a note in someone's handwriting, Harlan Foss's. He said, though I'd never seen Foss's hand before, that stated a man named Calhoun Briggs of Patience, Wyoming Territory, owed one Eustace Wells the sum of $600, or its equivalent in goods or services, in full settlement of debts arising from a transaction involving a female miner named Birch, services rendered in the territory during the winter months, and the conveyance of said miner to Patience in the spring. I read it through twice. There was a date on it and what might have been a notary mark, though it was faint enough that I wasn't sure the mark was real. This is fraudulent, I said. He said he didn't know about that, only that his father had held the note and it had been in his effects. Your father, I said carefully, transported a 14-year-old girl across the territory based on a promise from a con man who had no right to offer what he was offering and no intention of paying what he promised. Whatever your father believed he was owed, and I'm sorry for what happened to him, he's not owed it by me, and neither Foss nor any court in this territory would say differently. Young Wells held my eyes. He was working out the situation, going through it the way you go through a piece of country you haven't crossed before. She's here, he said. She's here, she works in this shop. She goes to school, she's 17. He looked at the work table. He looked at the note in his hand. He folded it and put it in his coat. My father wasn't a bad man, he said. I'm not saying what he did was right. I'm saying he wasn't a bad man. I heard that, I said. I believe it, but he made a bad bargain with someone who had nothing to sell, and I can't make that good. He was quiet for a moment. She all right, he said. It came out simply without strategy. Yes, I said. He nodded. He turned toward the door and stopped. My father used to say she was the sharpest girl he'd come across, he said. Said she kept his camp accounts better than he could. He stopped, he said. He felt bad about it. Later, I know he did. She's all right, I said again. She's going to be better than all right. He left. I watched him ride south from the window, until he was around the bend and gone. And then I went through the connecting door to the back room where Nora was working. She was sitting at the table with a supply order spread out in front of her, and her hands were flat on either side of it, and she was looking at the opposite wall. I told her everything, the note, the amount, what I'd said and what he'd said. She listened without moving. Then she said, "Foss is using my name to run paper." "At least once. There could be others. There could be." She was quiet for a long time. The wind moved along the alley outside. Porter shifted under the work table and resettled. "I want to be able to take care of myself," she said, "not part way, all the way. I don't want there to be any angle from which someone can do something like this." "Then we work toward that," I said. She looked up. "You mean it?" she said, not a question. She'd been with me long enough to know that I generally meant what I said, but there were things she still checked. "I mean most things I say," I said. "It's a habit." The corner of her mouth moved. She went back to the supply order. She was 18 when she left for school in Denver. This sounds abrupt when I say it that way. It was not abrupt. It took a year and a half of working toward it, researching academies by letter, writing to 3 of them and comparing their responses, settling on one in Denver that offered a 2-year course in commercial accounting and bookkeeping. There were letters back and forth about admission terms. The academy's position was that a young woman without a family sponsor presented complications. Nora's position, stated in 2 very direct letters that I read before she sent them, was that she was a self-supporting professional woman whose work record and references spoke clearly to her capability, and that the academy's complications were not her problem to solve. She laid out her qualifications, provided Alcott's recommendation and one from Galloway, and stated the terms under which she was willing to enroll. They accepted her. She came and told me in the shop doorway, holding the letter, with an expression I had not seen on her before, not happiness exactly, though it was partway there. More like the face of someone who has been pushing against a wall for a long time and has just felt it give. Ferocious, satisfied, the look of someone who has demonstrated something. "September," she said. "Good," I said. "I'll need the train fare and the first term's fee. I've worked out the figure." She named it. "I'll pay it back the first year after I finish." "No, you won't," I said. She looked at me. "You've kept this shop's books for 3 years," I said. "You've earned it 3 times over." She stood in the doorway. "Calhoun," she said, and that was the first time she'd said my given name without the formal address. Just my name, the way you say someone's name when you want to be sure they're actually hearing you. You don't have to. "I know," I said. "Go to Denver. Learn what you want to learn. Come back when you want to." She left in September. I drove her to the station. She had a new bag, a proper one with 2 latches, which she'd bought herself with her own earnings. She had her hair pinned up, which I'd seen her do a few times in the last year for church or for a meeting with one of the other businesses she'd taken on. She looked like someone departing with intention. At the platform, she looked at me and said, "Don't let the back burner go cold." "I'll manage," I said. "Porter likes to be fed before supper, not after. He sulks if you wait. I know how to feed my own dog." She smiled. A full one she didn't always. She had a small smile she gave to things that were mildly funny, and a larger one she gave to things that deserved it, and this was the larger one. She got on the train. The shop was quieter than I'd expected. Not just quieter, a different quality of quiet. Like a sound you've been hearing so long you forgot it was there, and now you notice the absence of it but not the sound itself. That's the closest I can get to it. She came back for Christmas. I drove to the station and stood on the platform with the wagon behind me, and I watched her come down off the train steps with a new winter coat, dark green wool, brass buttons, practical and good-looking in the way of things that are bought to be used rather than admired, and her hair pinned in a slightly different arrangement than when she'd left, more assured, like she'd decided how she wanted to look and done that. She walked differently, too. Not differently from herself, more like herself, like she'd had 4 months of being exactly who she was without the context of this town and what it thought of her, and she'd settled into it. She saw me, she stopped for one beat. Then she came across the platform and took my hand in both of hers and said, "It's good to see you." "You look well," I said. My voice came out level, which was what I wanted. "I am well," she said. The arithmetic is not as challenging as I expected. The bookkeeping principles are more interesting. The other students are, she considered, manageable. High praise, I said. Come on, I want to see Porter. She spent 3 weeks. She helped in the shop in the mornings and worked on academy problems in the afternoons and cooked more than I'd been cooking since September, which was noticeable because I had not been cooking well on my own. We ate supper together every evening and talked the way people talk when they've been in the habit of it and there's been a gap, tentatively at first, finding the right register again, and then more easily. She asked about Alcott, about Galloway, about the woman who ran the dry goods, about the widow 2 streets over whose husband had died in August. She asked about the business. She asked whether Marin had come back, and I told her he'd moved his operation to Laramie the previous spring, which she received with the kind of satisfaction she didn't bother to conceal. On her last night she asked if I'd been lonely. I looked at her across the table, the lamp between us, Porter at the foot of the stove. Some, I said. She nodded, I thought so. You're not very good at having people around, but you're worse at not having them. I didn't answer that immediately. That's probably accurate, I said. I'll come back in June, she said, for the whole summer. She came back in June. She was 19 that summer, and this is the part I said I'd need to be careful about, and I meant it. I was 46. There is no version of this story where the arithmetic isn't there, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. A man of 46 and a young woman of 19 is not the same thing as a man of 41 and a child of 14, but it requires thinking about, and I did the thinking. Most of it on the porch in the evenings when she'd gone inside, sitting with Porter and watching the dark come down off the mountains, going through it the way I'd go through a mechanism that wasn't working right, looking for where the fault actually was, what the genuine problem was, whether what I'd identified as a problem was real or whether it was the shape my anxiety was giving to something else. The question I kept coming back to was simple and hard. Did I have any right to what I was feeling? I had been responsible for her. She'd been a child under my care. The care itself had been honest. I was certain of that. I would have been certain of it under any examination, but care creates attachment in both directions, and a man has to be clear-eyed about that. He can't just wave it away. He has to look at it directly and ask, is this real and is it mine to feel and is she free? What I came to after a summer of working it through was this. She was not the girl I'd taken in. She was not mine in any sense that placed me above her. She was a young woman who had worked and studied and argued her own way into a life she'd built herself, with her own money and her own letters and her own force of will. Whatever she chose, she'd be choosing as a free person. Nothing between us gave me any claim on those choices. I did not tell her any of this that summer. I kept the thought to myself and did my work and fed the dog and let the summer be what it was. She went back in September. At the station, she put her hand on my arm. She was wearing the green coat despite it being early for it, still warm enough that she didn't need it. She just liked it, and she looked up at me and said, "You're going to tell me something when I finish school." I held very still. "I'll wait," she said, "but not longer than that." She got on the train. That second year in Denver was longer than the first. I don't mean in hours. I mean in the quality of it, the particular weight a year carries when you're working something out inside yourself and the working out is slow. I kept to my routine. I opened the shop at 7, worked through until dark, ate supper, read for a while, went to bed. The routine was the same as it had been for years before Nora came, and for the most part it held me. But there were evenings where it didn't hold so well, and I'd find myself on the porch after dark doing nothing in particular, which was not something I'd done before she'd been there to sit on the porch with. She wrote regularly. Every 2 weeks, a letter, 4 or 5 pages in her compact handwriting. She wrote about the coursework. She was developing particular interests in the theory of it, she said, not just the practice. Why accounts were structured the way they were, what principles underlay the conventions, where the conventions came from and whether they were the best answer or just the established one. She wrote about a professor who was, in her assessment, more interested in the sound of his own method than in the outcome it produced, and who she was handling by learning his method precisely, and then examining it separately on her own time. She wrote about a girl she'd become friends with, a farmer's daughter from Nebraska, Lena something, who had an interest in running her own operation someday, and who Nora said thought with real originality. I was glad to hear there was someone she called a friend. She also wrote about the city itself. Denver was larger than anywhere she'd been, she said, and she found it interesting and tiring in equal measure. The density of people, the way everyone had a transaction in mind, the way anonymity worked in a large place. She said she was not sure she wanted to live in a city permanently. She said she thought she was made for smaller things. I wrote back. I wrote about the work, about the season, about Porter and the kitchen garden she'd started and that I was maintaining imperfectly. I wrote about the town, who'd left, who'd arrived, what had changed and what hadn't. I wrote more than I'd written to anyone in years, maybe more than I'd written to anyone ever, and I noticed this but didn't examine it particularly, because the examination was beside the point. She came home for Christmas again. Lena came with her because Lena had no family nearby and Nora had told her she was welcome, which she'd decided without asking me. I didn't mind. Lena was a solid young woman with a sharp eye and a talent for saying the obvious thing that everyone else had been avoiding. And she and Nora had the easy shorthand of people who have worked alongside each other under pressure. She slept in the spare room, and Nora slept in her room with the faded green curtains, and we had a full table for Christmas dinner, which I found I liked more than I'd expected. Galloway came too, because Galloway had no family either, and nobody could think of a reason not to ask him. It was a loud Christmas by my usual standards. I cooked a ham badly, and Nora fixed it without commenting on what had gone wrong, which was a kindness. Lena went on to her own people in the new year, and Nora stayed through January, longer than she'd stayed the year before. She said she was ahead on her assignments and could afford it. On her last morning, she came out to the shop while I was doing the morning setup and sat on the stool beside the work table the way she used to when she was helping me think through a problem. She didn't say anything for a while, just sat, and I worked around her. Then she said, "You wrote more letters this year." "There was more to say," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "I'll be done in May," she said. "I know. I'm coming home." I set down what I was holding. I looked at her. "Good," I said. She got up off the stool and went back inside to finish packing. She finished in May of the following year at the top of her class. She wrote to tell me her marks. She wrote to say she was coming home in June. She did not mention what she'd said at the station a year before, and neither did I in the letters I sent back. I thought about it every day for 6 weeks. What I thought about was the arithmetic. What I thought about was the gap between what I could offer her and what a man her own age could offer. What I thought about was whether wanting something for yourself could coexist with genuinely wanting what was best for somebody else, or whether one of those always won and the other was just what you told yourself. I also thought about the fact that she'd told me she'd wait, and that Nora Birch did not say things she didn't mean. I had 6 years of clear evidence on that point. She arrived on a Thursday late afternoon, the sun already off the street and the air cooling down in the way it did in June when there was still some winter left in the mountains. I was at the station. I had my hat in my hands. She came off the train with the trunk now, not just a bag, and she looked different than she had at Christmas, settled in some new way, like she'd resolved something. She walked like someone who had arrived where she was going. She saw me. She came straight across the platform. She stood close enough that I could see the small things, the particular way her dark eyes moved across a person's face when she was reading them, which she did quickly and completely, the way she'd always done. "Well," she said. My hat was in my hands. I'd put dents in the brim without noticing. "I'm 47 years old," I said. "I have a gun shop in a small town. I have a dog. I have a house with a curtain in one room that's faded to about the color of sage, and I put in a kitchen garden 2 years ago that produces more than I know what to do with, and I haven't found a better way to be in the world than fixing what's broken and being straight with people. That's what I have." "I know all of that," she said. "It's not. Calhoun." I stopped. She said, "I am 20 years old. I have been making careful decisions my entire life because there was no one to catch me if I made a bad one. I know the difference between what I want and what someone is selling me." She held my eyes. "I know the difference between a man who sees what a situation can do for him and a man who just does what the situation requires." The station was moving around us, a child calling for someone, a cart being loaded. "You stood between me and everything that wanted to use me," she said. "Not because you wanted something in return, not because you were building toward anything, because it was right." She said the last word plainly, without any addition to it. There's not a lot of that. I've seen enough of the world now to know there isn't much of it. You'd be taking on an old man, I said. You're not old, she said. You're steady, those aren't the same thing. I reached out and took her hand. She let me, and she curled her fingers around mine with a certainty that was completely like her, unhurried, decided. She looked up at me with those dark eyes that had been accounting for things since the first afternoon on my porch, and there was nothing in them that was uncertain. Take me home, she said. I want to see what you've done to the books in my absence. The books are fine, I said. I'll be the judge of that. We were married in September at the church. Galloway officiated. He had not gotten more tactful in the years since he'd talked about Christian regard from the pulpit, but he was warm about it in his blunt way, and the ceremony was short and direct in the way he liked everything. Alcott stood up for me because I did not have anyone else who qualified for the role, and he did it with a particular grace that I appreciated. Nora had a dress made ivory, not white, the kind of choice she made about things, practical enough to be worn again, which she intended to do and did. She carried a small bunch of the last fall flowers from along the creek, yellow ones. I don't know what they're properly called, and she had her hair the way she wore it since Denver. I stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle and thought, this woman chose this. She was not arranged into it. She was not sold into it. She was not running out of options. She looked at what was available to her in the world, and she decided freely with everything she knew and had seen, and this is what she decided. That is not a small thing to live with. I don't know that I can properly explain, to any man who hasn't felt it, what it means to be chosen like that. Not picked because you were the best remaining option, or because circumstances had narrowed things down to you and one other, or because someone needed what you could provide and was willing to accept you as the cost. Chosen because she looked at you directly and made a judgment. Chosen because she knew your faults. She had lived in the same house with them for years. She had cataloged them all and decided that what you were outweighed what you weren't. I had spent a long time being adequate. I was good at my work. I was honest. I caused no serious trouble. In patience, those things had accumulated a kind of quiet regard, which is not the same thing as being seen. It's being included in the category of reliable. It's being thought of when something needs doing. It is not being thought of particularly. She thought of me particularly. That is what I mean when I say it's not a small thing. The first year of marriage taught me things I hadn't expected to learn at 47. The shop changed. She moved into the business side completely, not because I asked, but because it was clearly where her ability was, and she moved into it the way water moves into the shape that's available naturally, without waste. She renegotiated terms with my two main suppliers within the first month, sat down with them each separately, and went through figures they'd assumed I'd never examine, and came away with prices I hadn't been able to get in a decade of the same relationship. She told me afterward that one of the suppliers had seemed surprised that I'd sent a woman to negotiate, and that she'd addressed this directly by showing him the numbers line by line and asking whether the numbers were correct, and that he'd had to agree they were, and that had settled the matter of whether her gender was relevant. She opened her own accounts, commercial bookkeeping for other businesses in town, which she did in the mornings before the shop opened, at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her and her pencil moving fast and clean down the columns. By the end of the first year, she had 6 accounts. By the end of the second, she had 12 and had taken on a woman named Mrs. Taft, a quiet widow with good handwriting and a head for detail, to help with the copying work. They operated out of a second room in the shop that had previously been the parts room, which I reorganized to make space for them. What I hadn't expected, what surprised me, though it probably shouldn't have, was how funny she was. I had known she had a dry edge. I'd seen it occasionally over the years, a precise observation delivered without decoration that landed harder than a joke would have. But in domestic life, in the ease of a shared house, it turned out she had a very particular kind of wit that came out in the everyday, in the small absurdities of things, in the gap between how something was supposed to work and how it actually did. She would say something completely plain about something that was plainly ridiculous, and then go back to what she was doing, and I would be standing there trying to recover. I had not laughed that consistently since I was young. I had not been sure the capacity was still in me. The trouble with Foss came 3 years into the marriage. Not in patience, I want to be clear, he didn't come here. He appeared in a town called Mercer, about 40 miles north, in the context of a different scheme, and the connection to us came through the man it affected. He'd taken a new wife in Colorado, a woman named Bessie Crow, and had brought her north and had been running what appeared to be an earlier version of what he'd done with Nora's mother. False prospects, fabricated debts in other men's names, the general architecture of a man who makes his living by attaching himself to people who trust him and taking what he can before they realize what's happening. Bessie's brother was a rancher named Robert Crow. He came to Patience looking for me because someone had told him I had history with Foss. He was a solid man, about my age, with the look of someone carrying something he didn't know how to put down. He said his sister was in a bad situation. He said he'd heard about Nora, not from anyone who knew us directly, from a chain of third-hand accounts, and he asked if she might be willing to talk to him. I told him I'd ask. I told Nora that evening. I told her everything the man had said it out plainly, and then I stopped and waited. She thought about it. She said, "He can come." He came the next morning. He and Nora sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. I worked in the shop and did not listen because it wasn't my conversation. She had been the one who'd lived it. She was the one whose account meant anything. At the end of 2 hours, she came and found me in the shop and said that Robert Crow was going to take his sister to the territorial marshal and that Nora was going to write a statement. She wrote it that afternoon. 4 pages, plain and precise, beginning with November of the year she was 14. The trade, the winter, Wells, the journey north, the fraudulent note, Tad Wells at my counter. She read it aloud to me when she was done, each sentence deliberate. "Is it right?" she asked. "It's right," I said. She signed it. She gave it to Robert Crow the following morning, and he rode north with it toward the marshal's office. 6 weeks later, I heard from Alcott, who'd heard from a traveling man that Foss had been arrested in Mercer. I told Nora at supper. She put down her fork. She looked at the window, which was dark by then, showing nothing but the reflection of the lamp. She sat with it for a moment. "Good," she said. She picked up her fork. I did not bring it up again, neither did she. The years after that were quiet in the way that good years are quiet, not without things happening, but consistent. Settled in the way a well-made mechanism is settled. Every part in the right relation to every other, doing what it was meant to do, wearing well. The shop did well. Nora's bookkeeping business kept growing until she had accounts from most of the established businesses in Patience and several in surrounding towns. Mrs. Taft stayed on, and they added a second table in the back room. The business paid for itself and then some, and Nora managed its finances with the same clean, fast precision she'd applied to everything else, without drama and without wasted motion. The house changed the way a house changes when someone has decided they live in it and intends to go on living in it. There were curtains in every room eventually. There were 2 chairs on the porch. I built the second one myself, which took more effort than a gunsmith should probably admit, but it came out level. The kitchen garden went in the second spring and expanded every year, until by the 5th year it was producing enough that Nora was putting things up for the winter and still giving produce away, and we built a root cellar off the back of the house to hold it all. I made the root cellar myself too, which went better than the chair. I was pleased with it. In the 3rd year, Lena came and stayed for a month in the summer. She was working as a land agent's bookkeeper in Colorado, and she wanted to talk through some ideas she had about starting her own accounting practice, and Nora was the person she wanted to talk to. They spent most of that month at the kitchen table with papers spread between them, and I cooked supper for 3 and stayed out of the way, which was a better allocation of everyone's talents. When Lena left, she shook my hand at the station and said, in her direct way, "She's been better since she came home. I wanted you to know that." I said I was glad. She looked at me. "I mean better in herself," she said, "not just happier. More like who she is." I thought about that on the walk back from the station, about what it meant to be more like who you were, about how some things in a person are always there, but they need the right ground to come up in. The town had settled into a full understanding of what we were to each other by then, which was something I noticed mainly because the noticing went away. There was a period where I'd been aware of how people saw us, the slight angle of assessment that was always there, and then one day I realized it wasn't there anymore. We were just Briggs and his wife, the gunsmith and the woman who kept half the town's accounts, the couple with the kitchen garden and the 2 porch chairs. Alcott told me one evening, walking back from a meeting about the school's winter needs, that he'd run into a man passing through who'd asked about the town's business people and mentioned Nora specifically. He'd heard her name in connection with the business in the next town over, some reliable mention, and wanted to know about engaging her. Alcott said he'd given the man my shop's address. "She's building a reputation," Alcott said, "past the county." "Good," I said. He walked a few steps and then said, "She was always going to be something, you know. You gave her the ground to stand on. That's not nothing." I said I'd had the easy part, which was true. The standing was hers. Porter died in the 4th year. He was old. I'd never known his precise age. He'd been middle-aged when I got him, and he died in his sleep under the work table, which was where he'd spent most of his life. I found him in the morning. I buried him behind the kitchen garden, in the ground that was soft there from the watering, and I did not make much of it. But that evening at supper, Nora reached across the table without any preamble and put her hand over mine and held it for a moment, not long, just a moment, and then went back to her food. She didn't say anything, she just did that. I thought about it for a long time after, about how much a person can say without saying anything, about how being known is different from being understood, and how both of them are different from being seen. We were sitting on the porch one evening, I think our 6th year, watching the light go off the mountains to the west. June light, long and particular, the kind that makes the mountains look like they're lit from inside for about 20 minutes before it goes. Nora had her account book beside her, but she wasn't working. She was watching the mountains with that still, considering expression she had when she was deciding what she thought about something. She said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" I said I didn't. She said, "I think about the porch, your porch that first day. I was standing at the edge of it trying to decide if I was allowed to be there." I looked at her. "I'd been going over what I could offer," she said. "Everything I could do. I'd been rehearsing it in my head since we left the last camp. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, I'll learn whatever else. Making a case." She paused. "I was terrified that you'd look at me and decide it wasn't worth it. The math didn't add up in my favor, and I knew it." "You weren't a burden," I said. "I know that now. Then I was trying to make sure you knew it." She turned to look at me. "And then you just said come inside, like it wasn't a calculation at all." "It wasn't," I said. "I know," she held my eyes. "That was the first time in a long time that someone did something for me that didn't have terms on it. That wasn't part of an arrangement or a trade or a debt I was going to owe. It was just—" She looked at the mountains again. "It took me a while to trust that it was what it looked like. I kept waiting for the other part." "The price," I said. "Yes," she said it simply. "And then I was sure there wasn't one, and I decided." She reached out and took my hand on the arm of the chair, her fingers around mine the same way they'd been the day at the station, certain and unhurried. And we sat there on the porch while the mountain light went amber and then rose, and then the particular deep blue that comes right before dark. I was 53 years old. I had a gun shop. I had a house with a root cellar and a kitchen garden and a spare room that had curtains. I had a woman beside me who'd had every reason in the world to expect the worst from people, and who had looked at me anyway, with clear eyes and all the evidence available to her, and decided I was worth staying. I don't know what more a man could want than that. I've thought about it. I can't come up with an answer. There's one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'm done. Last fall a traveling man came through with a wagon of trade goods, dry goods, some tools, some hardware. He stopped to have a lock mechanism looked at on a tool chest, which had seized up from road dust getting into the housing. While I worked on it, he talked the way traveling men do about the road and the towns and what he'd seen. He mentioned a name at some point. Not Foss, he'd never heard of Foss. He mentioned a rancher he'd done some business with in Colorado, a man named Robert Crow. Said he was a solid operator, well regarded in his county, had a sister who'd had a bad situation a few years back but had come through it and was doing well. I said I'd heard that name. He said, "Good man from what I could see." I said from what I knew he was. He took his tool chest and went on. I stood at the window and watched the wagon go down the street, and then I went to the back room where Nora was working and told her. Easy, the way you tell your wife something you heard that she'd want to know. She was at the table with an account spread out in front of her. She didn't look up right away. Then she said, "Good. I'm glad Bessie got out." She went back to the figures. I went to finish closing up the shop. A while later, I heard her in the kitchen, and then at the lamp, and then the bedroom door. I came in and the room was dark and she was in bed, and after a while she reached out in the dark and put her hand on my arm, not asking for anything, just putting it there. I put my hand over hers. Outside, the October wind was moving through the gap to the south, the cold edge of it finding the window seams, the way it does every year when the season turns. The dark was good. She was warm beside me, her breathing slow. I lay there thinking about a girl standing at the edge of a porch, working out whether she was allowed to be there, working out her offer, adding up her case. She was always allowed. Some things take time to say plain, some debts you owe to the plain saying of them, even years later. So here it is, plain as I can make it. She chose me, freely with clear eyes, knowing everything. She looked at who I was, all of it, the faults and the limits and the 47 years of a life that had not been especially remarkable, and she decided I was worth choosing. A man can build things and fix things and stand his ground and do what's right his whole life. And those things matter. They're the things that make you worth something. But it's a particular kind of weight taken off a man when someone who sees him completely, who has no reason not to see him clearly, when that person decides to stay. I've been carrying that weight lifted for a long time now. I expect I'll carry it the rest of my life, and I don't intend to set it down.